Hi, this is Jen Rubin, and this is Jen Rubin's Green Room. It's great to be back with you after a short break. There's lots and lots of news to talk about. Let's talk economics for a little bit. On one hand, you have Vice President Harris, who has put together a whole series of specific proposals: tax incentives for developers, tax incentives for small businesses, support for first time homebuyers, child tax credits, a whole panoply of things that will both stimulate the economy and help the middle class, but also generate growth. What does Donald Trump come forth with? Well, it's hard to say because if you caught any of his speech, I use the word very loosely, speech, at the New York Economic Club, it was just verbal incontinence. When he attempts to respond to a question like childcare, he just blathers. He has no idea what kind of policy he wants. He doesn't care about policy. He cares about himself. He cares about getting elected and then sparing himself from criminal prosecution. So, what does he rely on? Tariffs? Really? A monumental tax on every single consumer and a threat to the international world economic order? That's what he's relying on? That's his policy? Well, there's no doubt that Kamala Harris would be pro growth, pro economy, pro employment. And as a result, people like Goldman Sachs, yeah, that left wing organization, Goldman Sachs, has come out and said she would be better for the economy. Growth would be higher, employment would be higher, inflation would be lower. And today, Friday, you had 90 CEOs come out and endorse her. That's because she's the only serious candidate. And what's more, whenever she comes out with something, it is far less radical than the press, than the Republicans conceive that she is up to. So when she spoke about keeping costs low for home buyers, for example, oh, price controls, she's talking about. No, she's not. She's talking about enforcing antitrust laws. So she is a center left candidate with straightforward economic proposals that would help the economy. So what does the press do? Oh, she hasn't given us enough detail. Are they out of their minds? Of course she's given detail. Trump has given none. And he is entirely intellectually frozen, paralyzed, and inadequate to the job. But the press continues to treat him like a normal candidate. And if you read the New York Times coverage of that economic club speech, you'd think he was making an argument, making a suggestion. No, he wasn't. He's utterly irrational. So why does the press keep covering for him? Because they are so wedded to this notion that they, quote, can't choose sides, that they wind up choosing sides by frankly misrepresenting what he's saying, what he's doing. So Tuesday we will have the debate, and hopefully more of this will be clear. Now, I do not hold out hope that the ABC moderators will be any better than the CNN moderators, but that doesn't mean that Kamala Harris has to play by the same rules that Joe Biden does. She can raise issues. She can raise, for example, his desecration of the Arlington Cemetery. She can raise his blathering. She can raise his conviction. She can raise his abject racism and put him on defense. And when he goes off and blathers away, she can turn to him and say, I have no idea what you're saying, and neither does anyone else. So I think she's going to be a much tougher customer than Joe Biden was. At least we should hope so. Now, meanwhile, what else is going on? Well, the economy has slowed a little bit. And now we are awaiting the Federal Reserve, which probably waited a couple more months than was necessary before contemplating their rate cut. So we can shortly expect that there will be a 25, if not a 50 basis point cut, at which point the stock market will boom, people will feel better, and yes, that will inure to Kamala Harris's benefit. Whereupon Donald Trump, who has been trying to suggest that the Fed should do his political bidding will claim foul and claim they're interfering with the election. Speaking of interfering with the election, keep your eye on a couple legal developments. First of all, in New York, Trump is trying desperately to avoid being sentenced on September 18th. So he is going to try every trick in the book, including going back up to his saviors in the Supreme Court, to prevent him from actually being sentenced before the election. Now, understand this. He's not actually going to serve any time. There's going to be a year or more of post-conviction litigation. He's going to have appeals. He just doesn't want the specter of a conviction hanging over his head with an actual sentence, because people might feel a little squeamish, voting for someone who is heading to jail for any period of time. So he's going to scream foul. Understand this. There is no basis whatsoever for delaying this. He is simply trying to claim different rules because he's running to be president of the United States. And that's wrong. That's not what the law is. That's not what the rule of law should be about. But he's going to try it. So we'll see if he does it, and we'll see if once more this corrupt Supreme Court rides to his rescue and spares him the embarrassment of having an actual sentence handed down before the election. Meanwhile, in the January 6th case, we have a good judge who is relatively no nonsense, who now has to deal with this mess that the Supreme Court handed down. You recall that they carved out this very vague, very wide circle of immunity that Trump is going to enjoy from any kind of prosecution. And not only will certain acts not be prosecutable, but even the evidence of these official acts cannot be used. So she now has to go back and look at what they call the superseding indictment. That is a new indictment that the prosecutor came up with to try to meet the requirements of the Supreme Court. She's going to have to look at that and decide whether that meets the Supreme Court's requirements or not. So yesterday, Thursday, she set out a briefing schedule. Once again, you'll notice the pattern here. Donald Trump did not want this issue to proceed. He wants to litigate another issue, which is the cockamamie argument that Judge Cannon in Florida bought, namely that the special counsel is unconstitutional. It's a ridiculous argument. It's a ridiculous ruling. And frankly, Judge Chutkan says, I'm not really interested in what Judge Cannon had to say. And oh, by the way, there's binding precedent in the DC circuit that says the special counsel is perfectly constitutional. So she's not going to allow that to prevent us from going forward with the briefing schedule. I know this is a little bit in the weeds about his immunity defense. And we're going to hear not only about the allegations and how the prosecutor thinks those avoid a immunity claim, but we're also going to potentially hear some evidence that we haven't heard before, evidence from the grand jury, evidence that is not included in the indictment itself. Now, some of this may be redacted, so we may not get all of it, but we're going to hear more of what Donald Trump did, and we may even get a little bit of what Mike Pence told the grand jury and what Mike Pence is prepared to testify to. Because after all, that's one of the major issues. Was the president, in trying to persuade Mike Pence to violate his obligations and prevent the counting of the electoral votes, was that something that President Trump should be immune from prosecution? Now think about that. That's just nuts. That should even be in the realm of consideration. The President of the United States is trying to prevent the lawful counting of the electoral vote so that he can remain in power unconstitutionally. And this Supreme Court says, oh, he may be immune from prosecution for that. That's how absurd this is. And oh, by the way, when you look at the superseding indictment, it explains to you how bizarre, how inappropriate the Supreme Court's ruling has been. So you all remember those few hours when President Trump, did nothing as his supporters were ransacking the Capitol, threatening the vice president. Well, the prosecutor won't even be able to introduce evidence that the President of the United States did nothing during that time. What do you mean? They can't say that he allowed these protesters to run rampant? No, because after all, that's him acting in his role as commander-in-chief, head of national security, in not doing his job. That is mind-boggling. This kind of Swiss cheese approach to prosecuting a president who acted so unconstitutionally in such violation of every obligation he had should really remind us how utterly corrupt the Supreme Court is. And mark my words, we've not seen the end of them. God forbid this election should be very, very close and we have a repeat of Bush v. Gore. We know they will not do the right thing. So let's hope Kamala Harris and Tim Walz win by enough. So if it's not close, the Supreme Court can't cheat. Now, we also had another development this week, and that was Liz Cheney, who in fact did come through and say she was going to vote for Kamala Harris. There is no excuse, none, for any of these mealy-mouthed Republicans, including Mitt Romney, including many commentators, for saying, well, I won't vote for Trump, but I'm not going to vote for Kamala Harris. She says nonsense. If you really think that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, which he is, if you think Donald Trump, who refused to allow the peaceful transfer of power, is unfit, then you have to vote for the only person who can stop him. Otherwise, you're just an accessory to his unconstitutional, authoritarian, creepy behavior. So when you put it all that way, she's really deprived I don't even want to deign to call them serious commentators, but the Republicans who are trying to make some kind of argument that though they won't vote for Donald Trump, there's something terribly wrong with Kamala Harris, that they cannot bring themselves to vote for her. What is it about her that's so objectionable? What? She wants to defend Ukraine? What? She wants to have a pro-growth economic vision? What? She wants to respect the rule of law? It's all nonsense, because these people have sold their souls to the devil. Now, there are people who have actually sold their souls, and those are the people from Tenet Communications, a group of these right-wing nuts who have been lavishly paid by, it turns out, the Russians. Wow, isn't that a surprise? To spread their pro-Russian, pro-Trump propaganda. Well, a couple Russians were indicted, and they are going to be prosecuted. And it's going to be really interesting to find out who else may have been on the receiving end. Now, some people may not be paid because the people at Fox News apparently are so benighted that they don't actually need to receive cash from the Kremlin. They just do their bidding anyway. But it's a sign of how unpatriotic, how anti-American the MAGA right has become. They are doing the bidding of an enemy of the United States. They are traitors to democracy. They are traitors to America. So this is what we're up against. We're up against a press that will not accurately report on Donald Trump's mental, emotional deficiencies. We're up against a foreign power that is manipulating the right-wing media and pundits. We are up against Donald Trump, who will lie to the cows come home. And we are up against, frankly, the indifference and the short attention span of the American people. So what do? We turn out to vote. We get everyone else to turn out to vote. And we persuade our friends and our relations and our colleagues that this is it. This is the existential issue of our time. And if you believe in freedom, if you believe in any sort of democracy, if you don't want the government telling you when to have kids, you don't want the government telling you who to marry, you don't want the government to be making this into a Christian country, then you have to go out and vote. And you can. And we can beat this. Because finally, the Democrats have a candidate who can win. So keep the faith. Remember, click right there. You can subscribe. And we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.